The wind in Redemption Bluff had a name, and it was despair. It was a physical thing, a constant presence that scoured the plains of western Kansas, stripping paint from the sun-bleached clapboard buildings and driving fine, red dust into the lungs and souls of its inhabitants. The town was little more than a single, rutted street carved from the unforgiving earth, a place where life was measured in inches of rainfall and the grit of one's teeth. Hope was a currency scarcer than water, and judgment was handed out as freely as the stale biscuits at the general store. The people here were hard-bitten, their faces etched with the same harsh lines as the land they fought to tame. They were survivors, and survival bred suspicion. 10 miles out, where the last vestiges of the town's influence were swallowed by the endless sea of prairie grass, was Elijah Stone's ranch. It was a lonely kingdom of cattle, dust, and silence. Elijah, a man whose age was hard to guess but was somewhere on the far side of 40, moved through his days like a ghost haunting his own life. The sun had weathered his skin to the texture of old leather, and his eyes, a startling pale blue, held the vast, empty sorrow of the sky above him. It had been 3 years since Martha was taken by the fever, and the cabin still echoed with the absence of her. Every creak of the floorboards was a memory, every empty chair at the supper table an accusation. He worked from before the sun rose until his muscles screamed in protest, throwing himself into the brutal labor of the ranch as if he could physically exhaust the grief that clung to him like a shroud. But at night, in the suffocating quiet, the ghosts always returned. He was not a man given to whimsy. The decision to seek a wife was one of pure, stark pragmatism. The loneliness was a cancer, eating him from the inside out. He needed a companion, a partner to share the crushing weight of this existence. He had no time for courting, no heart for the delicate dance of romance. So he did what other lonely men on the frontier did. He wrote a letter. He sent it to a matrimonial agency back east, a place that felt as foreign and distant as the moon. His letter was blunt, honest, and stripped of all poetry. He described his land, his herd, and the quiet life he could offer. He did not speak of love, for he wasn't sure he had any left to give. He offered stability. In the West, that was a promise more valuable than gold. Her name was Claire Miller. Her reply, penned in a delicate, careful script that seemed entirely out of place in his calloused hands, was just as honest. She was a spinster from a respectable but poor family in Pennsylvania, a woman whose future held nothing but the slow, quiet fading of becoming a burden to her relatives. She did not write of passion or grand adventure. She wrote of wanting a home, a purpose. She sought refuge, and so a bargain was struck across 1,000 miles of wilderness. The day the train arrived, a plume of black smoke staining the pristine blue sky. Elijah stood on the platform feeling as awkward and out of place as a bull in a church. He had scrubbed his face until it was raw and wore his least worn shirt. When she stepped down from the carriage, the breath caught in his throat. The photograph she had sent did her no justice. She was possessed of a demure, fragile beauty, with hair the color of dark honey pinned up neatly and eyes the shade of a stormy sea. But it was those eyes that held him. They were not the eyes of a hopeful bride. They were guarded, shadowed with a deep, private hurt and a weary suspicion that told him she expected the world to disappoint her. She looked at him, at the dusty town, at the immense, intimidating emptiness of the plains stretching to the horizon, and he saw the flicker of fear she tried so hard to conceal. She did not love him. He knew it instantly. She was trading one cage for another, hoping this one would be larger. The ride to the ranch was a study in silence. The rattling of the wagon wheels was the only conversation between them. He pointed out landmarks, a lone butte, a creek bed that was dry more often than not, and she would nod. Her hands clenched tightly in her lap. He could feel her fragility, her eastern softness, and wondered if this harsh land would break her before the first winter snow. The first few days were a dance of excruciating awkwardness. They moved around each other in the small cabin like strangers forced to share a room. He was acutely aware of her presence, the soft scent of lavender that clung to her, the quiet rustle of her skirts. She was a delicate flower transplanted into a desert, and he had no idea how to tend to her. He tried, in his own gruff way. He built her a small shelf for her books, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the wood. He brought her a pail of fresh milk each morning, still warm from the cow. He never spoke of his first wife, but her presence was everywhere, in the faded curtains she had sewn, in the small rocking chair by the hearth. Claire, for her part, tried to find her footing. She learned to cook on the wood-burning stove, to knead bread with flour that always seemed to have a bit of dust in it. She watched him work, marveling at the quiet competence with which he handled the cattle, mended a fence, or calmed a spooked horse. She saw the deep sadness in him, but also a core of strength and decency that she hadn't expected. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, not speaking, simply watching the sun bleed across the sky in spectacular hues of orange and purple, in that shared silence, surrounded by the immense, wild beauty of the land. A fragile understanding began to grow. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. It was the shared recognition of two lonely souls, each bearing their own scars, finding a sliver of peace in the other's company. One afternoon, a week before the preacher was scheduled to make his circuit and marry them, the air was thick with the promise of a coming storm. Elijah was out on the far pasture, mending a fence line. Claire, seeking refuge from the oppressive heat in the confines of the cabin, found herself in the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled sweetly of hay and leather. A beam of golden, dust-moted sunlight slanted through a gap in the roof, illuminating a large, forgotten trunk in the corner of the loft. Curiosity piqued. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in layers of yellowed linen, was a wedding dress. It was simple, made of ivory lace, now aged to the color of cream. It was Martha's. Claire knew it without having to be told. A strange mix of emotions washed over her. Trespassing, sadness, a longing for something she couldn't name. On a sudden, inexplicable impulse, she slipped out of her own practical dress and lifted the lace gown over her head. It settled onto her shoulders, a little loose in the waist, the fabric cool against her skin. She was standing there, a ghost in another woman's dress, looking at her faint reflection in a dusty pane of glass, when a shadow fell across the wide-open barn door. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the blinding afternoon sun. She was thin and worn, her dress patched and faded, her face etched with a desperate exhaustion that went bone deep. But it was a face Elijah's memory could never erase. Flanking her, clutching at the tattered fabric of her skirt, were two small children, a boy and a girl. Twins by the look of them, no older than 5. Their faces were smudged with dirt, but their hair was the color of spun sunshine, and their eyes, wide with a silent, solemn curiosity, were the exact same shade of pale, startling blue as the man who owned this ranch. Elijah was just riding in, the weary slump of his shoulders speaking of a long day's work. He swung down from his horse, and his gaze fell upon the tableau at the barn door. He saw Claire, frozen in the dim interior, a pale specter in his dead wife's dress. Then he saw the woman in the doorway. Anna. The world stopped. The buzzing of the insects, the whisper of the wind, the very beat of his own heart. It all ceased. 6 years. 6 years since she had vanished from his life without a word, without a note, taking his heart and his future with her. And now she stood before him, a specter from a past he had tried to bury under years of hard labor and relentless grief. His eyes, however, were drawn down to the 2 small figures at her side. He saw his own father's chin in the boy, his own stubborn brow on the girl. He saw himself, a lifetime ago, staring back at him. His body went rigid. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a mask of stone, of disbelief and a pain so profound it was terrifying. He took a staggering step forward, his throat working but no sound emerging. Anna's composure finally broke. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, broken whisper that was nearly stolen by the wind. "Elijah," she breathed, her eyes pleading, desperate. "Don't send us away. I have nowhere else to go." For a long moment, the world was made of nothing but dust motes dancing in the shafts of light piercing the barn's gloom. Time itself seemed to have frozen, trapping them all in a terrible, silent painting. The woman in the doorway, a wraith of desperation. The two small, sun-haired children who were her anchors, the man in the yard, turned to stone, and the woman in the loft, a bride in a dead woman's dress. Claire felt the lace of the gown on her skin, suddenly coarse and suffocating. She watched Elijah, and in his stillness, she saw something break. It wasn't a loud shattering, but a deep, silent fracturing of the man she was just beginning to know. His face, usually a stoic landscape carved by sun and wind, was now a mask of raw, unguarded agony. His pale blue eyes, fixed on the children, were wide with a horror that was almost holy in its intensity. Claire's own shock was a cold, sharp thing, a shard of ice in her chest. Astonishment warred with a sudden, searing pain. She was an outsider to this drama, an actress who had wandered onto the wrong stage. Yet the betrayal felt as personal as a knife wound. This silent, grieving man had a past, a history so profound and unresolved that it had just walked back into his life, holding the hands of two small, living secrets. The silence stretched until it was a physical weight, pressing down on them all. It was Elijah who finally broke it. He took a step, then another, his movements stiff and unnatural, as if his limbs belonged to someone else. When he spoke, his voice was not the low, steady rumble she was used to. It was a ragged, strangled sound, ripped from the very depths of his panic. "Anna," he rasped, the name itself a ghost on his lips. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze dropping again to the children, who shrank back behind their mother's skirt. He swallowed, the sound loud in the unnerving quiet. "Are they—" He couldn't finish. He tried again, the question tearing out of him, a plea and an accusation all in one. "Are they mine?" The question hung in the hot, heavy air. Claire held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Anna flinch, her gaze dropping to the dusty ground, but she did not answer him. Her chin quivered, and she pulled her children closer, her entire being focused on a single, desperate purpose that had nothing to do with truth or lies, but with survival. "Elijah, please," she whispered, her voice thin and frayed. "We've been walking for 3 days. The children, they haven't had a proper meal, just a roof. Elijah, just for a little while, so they can eat, so they can sleep somewhere safe." Her refusal to answer was an answer in itself. It was a confirmation wrapped in a plea, a truth too devastating to be spoken aloud. Elijah seemed to physically recoil, the last bit of color draining from his face. He stared at her, then at the children, his mind clearly reeling, unable to process the cataclysm that had just erupted in his quiet, ordered world. For Claire, that was enough. The scene blurred through the hot tears that suddenly stung her eyes. She turned, her movements clumsy, and fumbled with the buttons of Martha's dress. The lace caught, snagging on her trembling fingers. A sob of pure frustration and misery escaped her. She ripped the last button free and let the dress fall to the dusty floor of the loft, a pool of creamy lace around her feet. Stepping out of it felt like shedding a skin she had no right to wear. In her simple chemise, she scrambled back into her own drab, practical dress, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fasten it. Then, without a backward glance, she fled the barn, fled the man and his past, and ran to the suffocating sanctuary of the cabin. She went straight to the small room that was to be hers, closing the door behind her with a soft, final click. The room was sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single small window that looked out onto the endless, indifferent prairie. She stood before it, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, feeling the phantom weight of a betrayal she had no official claim to. She wasn't his wife, not yet, but promises had been made, a future had been sketched out, a fragile hope for stability had taken root in her heart, and now that hope lay in ruins. She had come west to escape a life of being a burden, of being invisible. She had agreed to marry a stranger for the simple promise of a home. She had not expected this. She had not expected to be a bystander to a tragedy, an obstacle in a story that had begun long before she ever stepped off that train. Later, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray, the cabin door opened. She heard the shuffling of small feet, the murmur of Elijah's low voice giving quiet commands. She heard the splash of water, the scrape of a bench on the wooden floor. She remained in her room, a prisoner of her own turmoil, until a soft knock came at her door. "Claire?" It was Elijah. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "There's food." She didn't answer. She couldn't. A few moments later, she heard his footsteps retreat. Hunger was a distant, unimportant thing. The only thing she could feel was the gaping hole that had been torn in her carefully constructed future. Hours later, thirst finally drove her from her room. The main room of the cabin was lit by a single, low-burning lantern. Anna was slumped at the table, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Elijah sat opposite her, staring into a tin cup of coffee as if it held the answers to the universe. He looked up as Claire entered, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. He nodded toward the stove. "There's stew left." Claire shook her head, pouring herself a dipper of water from the bucket. The silence was thick with unspoken words. It was Anna who finally broke it, her voice muffled by her hands. "He found us," she said, her voice trembling. "The man I was with. He was a trader, dealt in whiskey and guns. A hard man." She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. She spoke in broken pieces, fragments of a miserable story falling from her lips like shards of glass. She had left Elijah, she explained, chasing a foolish dream of a better life in a boomtown further west. The dream had quickly soured. The man she went with had abandoned her as soon as her money ran out, alone, pregnant, and shamed. She had fallen in with the trader, a man named Silas. He had given her a roof over her head, but at a terrible price. He wasn't kind, she whispered, and the profound understatement of her words sent a chill through Claire. "When he drank, he had a temper. I stayed for the children, so they'd have food, but he started looking at the girl. In a way," she trailed off, shuddering. "I couldn't let that happen. So we ran. We just ran." Elijah listened, his knuckles white where he gripped his cup. His face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Claire could see the pity in the tight set of his jaw, a deep, sorrowful compassion for the woman he had once loved and the hell she had clearly endured. But she could also see the anger, a cold, hard fury simmering in the depths of his blue eyes. Anger at her for leaving. Anger for keeping his children from him. Anger for the 6 years of silence and lies. "Why didn't you write?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Why didn't you tell me?" Anna just shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Pride," she choked out. "Shame. I made a mess of everything. Elijah, I didn't want you to see what I'd become." The conversation died there, exhausted. Later, Elijah led the 2 sleeping children to the small room at the back of the cabin, the one that had belonged to his mother. He laid them gently on the old patchwork quilt, their small chests rising and falling in the steady rhythm of innocent sleep. They looked so small, so fragile, like 2 lost spirits who had finally found their way home. Claire watched from the doorway of her own room, a silent observer, the sight of the children, sleeping peacefully in this house that was supposed to be her future, was like a fresh twist of the knife. Everything was tangled, broken, There was no clear path forward. Her pragmatic arrangement with Elijah had just become a morass of passion, betrayal, and responsibility. She lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the house settling. The prairie wind moaned around the eaves, a lonely, desolate sound. Sometime deep in the night, a small cry broke the silence. It was the little boy. A nightmare, perhaps. Claire slipped out of her bed and crept to her door, peering into the main room. The lantern was turned down so low it barely cast a glow. In the dim light, she saw Elijah emerge from his own room. He went to his mother's old bedroom and disappeared inside. A moment later, he came out, cradling the small, whimpering boy in his powerful arms. He didn't take the boy back to bed. Instead, he carried him to the rocking chair by the cold hearth, the one that had been Martha's. He sat down, settling the child on his lap, and began to rock, his large, calloused hand stroking the boy's back in a slow, comforting rhythm. He murmured something too low for Claire to hear, his voice a gentle, soothing rumble. The boy's cries subsided into soft hiccups, and he snuggled against his father's chest, his small hand clutching Elijah's shirt. Claire stood rooted to the spot, hidden in the shadows of her doorway, and watched. Her heart, which she thought had been shattered into 1,000 pieces, began to ache with a completely new and unexpected emotion. The sight of this big, broken, grieving man, so impossibly tender with a child he had only just met, undid her completely. All the anger, all the pain of her own shattered hopes seemed to recede, replaced by a wave of something else, something warm and powerful and terrifying. It was in that moment, watching the silhouette of the cowboy holding his son in the dark, that Claire Miller understood a devastating truth. She had come west seeking stability. She had agreed to a loveless marriage for the sake of a home, but somewhere in the quiet evenings on the porch, somewhere in his gruff attempts at kindness, somewhere in the shared silence of their lonely lives, she had started to fall in love with him, and she knew, with a certainty that was both heartbreaking and absolute, that this impossible, agonizing love was going to destroy her. By morning, the world had returned to its harsh, unforgiving clarity. The emotional haze of the night had evaporated with the dew, leaving behind only the stark reality of the situation. For Claire, there was only one possible path. To stay would be to surrender her dignity, to accept a life as a footnote in a story of heartbreak and regret that was not her own. She could not build a home on the ruins of another's love, especially when that love was still a living, breathing thing that slept in the next room. She packed her small trunk with a quiet, methodical resolve. Each folded dress, each carefully placed book, was an act of severing a tie to this place. She had so little, yet it felt like she was leaving a lifetime behind. She had allowed a sliver of hope to penetrate the armor around her heart, and the wound it left as she tore it out was agonizing. She would take the wagon. She would drive it to Redemption Bluff and wait for the next eastbound train. What she would do when she got back to Pennsylvania. A returned failure was a problem for another day. Today was about escape. But the land had other plans. As she was securing the last strap on her trunk, she noticed a change in the light. The brilliant, sharp-edged morning sun had turned a sickly yellow. A strange stillness had fallen over the prairie. The birds were silent. The incessant buzz of insects had ceased. A low, guttural moan began on the horizon, a sound that was felt in the bones before it was heard by the ears. Elijah appeared at the cabin door, his face grim, his eyes scanning the northwestern sky. "Get inside, Claire, and bolt the door." "I'm leaving," she said, her voice sounding small and defiant against the rising wind. He spared her a single, hard glance. "You're not leaving today." He pointed toward the horizon, where a monstrous, roiling wall of brown was consuming the sky, erasing the line between earth and heaven. "Dust storm, a bad one." The word was barely out of his mouth before the first gust hit, a physical blow that slammed the cabin door shut and rattled the windows in their frames. The world outside vanished, Day turned to a suffocating, gritty twilight. The wind shrieked like a banshee, hurling sand and grit against the thin wooden walls of the cabin with the force of buckshot. Inside, the air grew thick, tasting of dirt. A fine red powder began to sift through invisible cracks, coating every surface in a film of dust. They were trapped, 3 adults and 2 children, sealed in a small wooden box as the world raged outside. The hours that followed were an eternity of tension. They moved in a claustrophobic orbit, the space between them charged with unspoken accusations and unresolved pain. Anna tried to make herself useful, her movements small and apologetic. The children, frightened by the storm's fury, were quiet and wide-eyed, clinging to their mother. Elijah stood by the window for a long time, a silent sentinel staring into the brown chaos, his shoulders bowed by a weight far heavier than the storm. By evening, the dust storm had given way to a driving, icy rain that quickly turned to sleet. The temperature plummeted. The wind still howled, but now it carried the bite of winter. The forced intimacy of the cabin finally cracked the veneer of civility. It began when Anna was humming a lullaby to her daughter, who had finally fallen asleep in her lap. It was a simple, sweet tune, but for Claire, it was the final indignity. She stood up from the table, her chair scraping loudly on the floor. "You have no right," Claire said, her voice low and trembling with a fury she could no longer contain. Anna looked up, startled, her humming cut short. I beg your pardon. To be here, to hum in this house, to act as if this is your home," Claire clarified, her words sharp and precise. "You forfeited that right 6 years ago." Anna flinched as if struck. She clutched her daughter tighter. "My children needed shelter." "And what about honor? What about the promises that were made to me?" Claire's control was slipping. The poise she prided herself on crumbling under the assault of her emotions. "I came 1,000 miles for a new life, a life that was built on a promise from this man, a promise you have made a mockery of. Honor is a luxury for women with full bellies and a safe place to sleep," Anna shot back, a spark of defiance in her weary eyes. "You have no idea what I've endured. You, with your fine dresses and your soft hands. You talk of promises, I talk of survival. I did what I had to do to keep my children alive." "And was lying to him part of that survival?" Claire pressed, gesturing toward Elijah, who stood by the hearth, his back to them, a rigid statue of misery. "Was keeping his own children a secret from him part of your hardship?" The accusation struck home. Anna's face crumpled. "I was ashamed," she whispered. "I loved him. I never stopped. But I had ruined everything. I couldn't bear for him to see what I had become." Claire let out a short, bitter laugh. "Love? You call that love? To vanish without a word? To let him believe you were gone forever? To let him grieve and build a new life? Only to return and tear it all down again?" She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You didn't come back for love, Anna. You came back because you ran out of options." Before Anna could reply, Elijah turned from the fireplace. His face was ravaged, his eyes hollowed out. "Enough," he commanded, his voice a low growl that silenced them both. He looked from one woman to the other, his gaze lingering on Claire for a moment with an expression of profound regret. Then he looked at Anna. "I loved you," he said, his voice raw with the sound of an old wound being torn open. "When you left, I thought the sun had fallen out of the sky. I thought I would die from it." He paused, shaking his head slowly, as if trying to clear it of ghosts. "But that was a long time ago. A different man." He finally met Claire's gaze again, and the look in his eyes made her heart ache. Now I'm not sure of anything at all." His confession hung in the air, a devastating admission of his own brokenness. It offered no comfort, only a shared sense of loss. Later that night, the storm reached its zenith. Sleet hammered against the roof, and the wind moaned like a dying animal. Sleep was impossible. Claire lay in her bed, listening to the cacophony, her mind replaying the day's events. Sometime after midnight, she heard a sound from the children's room, a small, sleepy murmur. She couldn't make it out at first. She heard Elijah's floorboards creak as he went to check on them. A few minutes later, the murmur came again, clearer this time, drifting through the thin walls. It was the little girl, talking in her sleep, and the words she said, soft and full of a child's simple, unquestioning certainty, was, "Pa." The sound pierced Claire's heart. It was the truth, pure and undeniable, spoken by a child who knew nothing of the chaos she had been born into. The cold was seeping into the cabin, a damp, penetrating chill that no blanket could fend off. The fire in the hearth had died down to sullen embers. Claire could hear the cattle lowing nervously in the barn, their sounds of distress carrying on the wind. She saw a flicker of light pass her window and realized Elijah had lit a lantern and gone outside. A sudden, inexplicable fear seized her, that he would be swallowed by the storm, that the cold and the wind would simply take him. On impulse, she threw a shawl over her shoulders and slipped out the cabin door. The wind and sleet tore at her, stealing her breath. She fought her way across the yard to the relative shelter of the barn. Inside, the air was thick with the warm, animal scent of hay and livestock, but the cold was still profound. Elijah was standing by the stall of a pregnant heifer, his hand resting on her flank, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows. He looked up, surprised, as she stumbled in. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice rough. "I was worried," she admitted, her teeth chattering. "The cold." They stood in silence for a moment, the storm raging around their small sanctuary. The lantern light flickered, threatening to go out. "The roof is leaking in the loft," he said, his voice flat. "I need to move some of the feed sacks." He turned and headed for the ladder, and without thinking, she followed. In the loft, the wind howled through the gaps in the roof, and icy drips of water fell onto the hay bales below. The cold was even more intense here. They worked in silence, dragging the heavy burlap sacks to the drier side of the loft. Her hands were numb, her body shaking uncontrollably from the chill. When they were finished, they stood huddled together in the one dry corner. Out of the wind, the lantern on the floor cast a weak, golden glow on their faces. She was shivering so violently she could barely stand. "Here," he said, his voice suddenly thick. He moved closer and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against the solid warmth of his chest. It was not a lover's embrace. It was a simple, desperate human act of sharing warmth against a killing cold. She leaned into him, burying her face in the rough wool of his coat, which smelled of snow and leather and him. His arms tightened around her, and for a moment, there was nothing but the storm outside and the solid, steady beat of his heart against her ear. But then, something shifted. The purely practical need for warmth deepened into something else entirely. The dam of restraint and propriety, already weakened by the day's emotional onslaught, finally broke. He made a low sound in his throat, and his hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cold cheek. He tilted her face up to his. In the flickering lantern light, his eyes were dark pools of a pain and a longing so profound it stole her breath. This was not the stoic rancher. This was the man who had loved and lost, the man whose heart had been shattered, the man who was drowning and desperately reaching for a lifeline. And in that moment, she was drowning, too. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce, desperate, and full of all the unspoken grief and confusion and burgeoning feeling that had been churning between them. It was a kiss of shared solitude, of overwhelming need. A raw and desperate collision of two broken people, finding a fleeting moment of solace in a world that had fallen apart. It was a transgression, a betrayal of everything they were supposed to be, and yet it felt like the only true thing in the universe. When they finally broke apart, They were both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. The guilt would come later. The consequences were a problem for the morning. In the dark, cold loft, with a storm as their witness, there was only this raw, undeniable connection. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a hot path down her cold cheek. She let out a shuddering breath, her voice a barely audible whisper against his lips. "I don't know if I have the right to love you," she confessed, her words a quiet surrender. "But I can't stop myself anymore." The dawn that followed the storm was unnervingly beautiful. The world, scoured clean by wind and sleet, glittered under a sky of pale, pristine blue. But inside the cabin, the air was thick and heavy with the memory of the night before. The kiss in the barn had not been a resolution. It was a lit match thrown into a powder keg. It existed between Elijah and Claire as a living entity, a silent third party in every stolen glance, in the careful way they avoided brushing hands as they reached for the coffee pot. Claire was consumed by a turbulent mix of shame and a fierce, terrifying joy. Every time she looked at Elijah, she felt the ghost of his lips on hers, the solid strength of his arms around her. She had come to the West for pragmatic reasons, but her heart, a long dormant and stubborn thing, had betrayed her. She told herself she must leave. It was the only honorable thing to do. The confession of love she had whispered in the dark had been a moment of weakness, a surrender she now had to rescind. Yet, the thought of walking away, of never again seeing the quiet pain in his eyes or feeling the electric current that now flowed between them, felt like a physical amputation. Her resolve, once so firm, was now as fragile as spun glass. She tried to erect a wall between them, speaking only when necessary, keeping her eyes fixed on her chores. But the wall was useless. Their awareness of each other was a palpable force, a magnetic pull that made the small cabin feel both immense and suffocatingly intimate. Elijah, too, seemed caught in the same current. He was quieter than ever, his movements strained, and more than once, she caught him watching her with an expression of such raw longing and confusion that she had to turn away, her heart hammering in her chest. The catalyst came mid-morning. Elijah was assessing the storm's damage to a section of the corral fence, and Claire brought him a cup of hot coffee. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, but it sent a jolt through them both. He didn't pull away. Instead, his gaze met hers, and for a long, silent moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. In his eyes, she saw the storm, the kiss, and a question he didn't dare ask. Her breath caught, her lips parted slightly, and she knew her own face reflected the same desperate, hopeless emotion. Neither of them saw Anna standing in the cabin doorway, watching. But Anna saw everything. She saw the way their hands lingered, the way they looked at each other, the invisible, charged space between them that excluded everyone else. She saw in that single, silent glance the death of her own desperate hope. The jealousy that ripped through her was a bitter, physical pain, sharp and hot as a branding iron. It was the pain of a woman who had lost everything, clawing her way back from the abyss only to find her last refuge occupied by another. That pain, mixed with desperation, forged a cruel weapon. When Elijah came back inside, leaving Claire to her mending, Anna cornered him. Her face was pale, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "You look at her like you used to look at me," she said, her voice a low, trembling accusation. Elijah sighed, running a weary hand through his hair. "Anna, don't—" "Don't?" she echoed, her voice rising. "I come back from the dead, with your children, and you tell me a don't?" Her composure shattered. "You want to know the truth, Elijah. You stand there asking if they're yours, looking at me like I'm a liar." She took a ragged breath, and the words she had withheld, the truth she had guarded out of shame and pride, finally came spilling out, laced with venom and despair. Yes, they are yours. They have always been yours. There has never been anyone else. I was carrying them when I left." Elijah stood as if he'd been struck by lightning. The ambiguity he had clung to, the sliver of doubt that had allowed him to function, was gone. He stared at her, his face ashen, the truth landing with the force of a physical blow. He had suspected. He had known it in his bones. But to hear the words spoken aloud, to have them confirmed as absolute fact, was another thing entirely. It was the closing of a cell door. Claire, drawn by the raised voices, had come to stand in the doorway of her room. She saw the look on Elijah's face, the utter devastation in his eyes as he turned toward her. He didn't have to say a word. She knew, the fragile hope she had dared to nurture, the memory of the kiss that had felt so real. All of it turned to ash. A sob escaped her, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. She didn't know what to do, where to run. To stay was impossible. To leave was unbearable. She was trapped in a grief that wasn't hers, for a family she could never be a part of. Elijah's shock slowly, terrifyingly, morphed into a cold, hard rage. He turned back to Anna, and the pity he had felt for her was gone, burned away by a father's protective fury. "You let my children, **our** children, starve?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "You let them live in filth and fear with a man who would hurt them. While I was here, this whole time." His voice rose, a roar of anguish and disbelief. "My son and my daughter have been living in hell, and you never told me. Your pride was more important than their safety, than their lives."
"I was scared,"
Anna cried, shrinking back from his anger.
"I didn't know what to do."
"You knew where I was," he thundered, taking a step toward her. "You knew this home was here. You let them suffer." His tirade was cut short by a weak, fretful cry from the back room. It was the little boy, Samuel. Anna rushed to his side, and a moment later, she called out, her voice laced with a new, sharper fear.
"Elijah, he's burning up."
The adult drama imploded. The anger, the jealousy, the heartbreak. It was all incinerated by the primal, terrifying fear for a child's life. Samuel was shivering violently, his small body radiating an intense heat, his face flushed a painful red, his eyes glassy and unfocused. The icy chill from the storm had settled deep in his lungs. What followed was a long, desperate battle waged in the dim light of the cabin. The two women, antagonists moments before, became a reluctant, unified force. They were no longer Claire and Anna, the intended and the former. They were simply two women fighting to keep a small flame from being extinguished. They worked in a grim, silent truce, moving around the small bed with a practiced efficiency born of necessity. Claire, with her calm, steady hands, bathed the boy's forehead with cool cloths. Anna, who knew the remedies of hardship, brewed a bitter tea from willow bark she found in her satchel, trying to coax the hot liquid between his cracked lips. Elijah was rendered helpless. He was a man of action, of fixing fences and roping cattle. But against a fever, his strength was useless. He paced the main room like a caged animal, his face a mask of agony, listening to every pained whimper, every shallow breath from the sick room. Night fell, deep and absolute. The vigil continued. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the boy's labored breathing, and the quiet, exhausted movements of the women. In the darkest hour, with their fear stretched to its breaking point, the walls between them finally crumbled. It was Claire who spoke first, her voice a hoarse whisper in the stillness.
"What were they like? The good times?"
she asked, not looking at Anna, her eyes fixed on Samuel's flushed face. "With you and him?" Anna was silent for a long moment, continuing to sponge the boy's small arm. When she answered, her voice was thick with unshed tears. "He was different then," she said softly. "Younger, full of laughter. We were going to build a dynasty out of dust and dreams. She managed a small, sad smile. He used to sing badly. He'd make up songs about the cattle and the prairie dogs. He made me feel like I was the only person in the world. She looked at Claire, her eyes full of a shared, tragic knowledge. He's not that man anymore, is he? No, Claire whispered. The man I met is quiet. He carries a grief so heavy, I don't know how he stands. She paused, the confession painful. I fell in love with his sadness. I think with the strength it took him to endure it. They were silent again, the shared intimacy of their confessions hanging between them. They were two women who had been wounded by the same man, one by his love and her abandonment of it, the other by his grief and her inability to heal it. They loved him in entirely different ways, for entirely different reasons. And in that moment, in the face of losing a part of him, they finally understood each other. While they kept their watch, Elijah found his way to the barn. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of hay and lingering snow. He fell to his knees in the very spot where he had held Claire, the memory of her kiss a fresh, open wound. He was not a man given to easy prayer, but tonight, the words were torn from him, a desperate, broken plea to a God he wasn't sure was listening. He prayed for his son, his voice choking with a father's terror, and then he prayed for himself. He was caught in an impossible snare. There was Anna, the mother of his children, a ghost from his past made flesh, a woman he was bound to by blood and history. And there was Claire, the woman who had quietly slipped past his defenses and reawakened a part of his heart he thought had died with Martha. Duty and desire, past and future. He begged for a sign, for a path, for a way out of the torment. As dawn approached, the crisis in the sick room reached its peak. Samuel's breathing grew alarmingly shallow. Anna let out a small, choked sob, and Claire reached out, her hand covering Anna's in a gesture of shared, desperate solidarity. They watched, helpless, as the boy's life seemed to flicker like a guttering candle. And then, a change, a deep, shuddering breath. Samuel stirred. His small brow furrowed, a sheen of sweat, clean and cool, broke out across his forehead. His shivering subsided. His breathing, while still weak, deepened and became regular. The fever had broken. A wave of relief so profound it was physically debilitating washed over the two women. Anna buried her face in her hands and wept openly, her body shaking with the release of hours of tension. Claire felt tears stream down her own face, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. The immediate danger had passed. The child would live. As the first, clean rays of the morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes in the quiet room, a new reality settled over them. The fight for Samuel's life had burned away all the pretenses, all the anger and jealousy, but in its place was a heavy, unavoidable clarity. The shared ordeal had healed a rift between the two women, but it had also solidified the impossible choice that now lay before Elijah. The fever was gone, but the healing of their fractured lives would demand a sacrifice, and all three of them knew, in the weary silence of the new day, that a decision could no longer be deferred. In the days that followed Samuel's recovery, a fragile truce settled over the small cabin. The fever had burned away the sharp edges of their animosity, leaving a landscape of shared exhaustion and a quiet, unspoken understanding. Anna, stripped of her pride, was devoted to her children with a gentle, weary tenderness. Claire, her own heart a confusing territory of pain and burgeoning love, found herself watching the small family with a strange, maternal ache, and Elijah moved between the two women with a heavy, weighted silence, his gaze holding a new and profound conflict. The question of the future was a sleeping beast in the center of the room, and no one dared to wake it. But the world outside the ranch did not sleep. A week after the storm, supplies ran low, and a trip to Redemption Bluff was unavoidable, the moment their wagon rolled down the single, dusty street. Claire felt the change. Conversations on the boardwalk didn't just quiet, they stopped cold. Windows that had been empty suddenly held shadowed faces. They were met with a barrage of hard, assessing stares. Looks that dissected and judged, lingering on Anna's worn face and then on the two blonde-haired children who were miniature. Undeniable echoes of Elijah Stone. The general store was a crucible of whispered speculation. As Elijah negotiated for flour and salt with the storekeeper, Mr. Gable, Claire stood near the dry goods, pretending to inspect a bolt of calico. But she could hear the women, clustered by the pickle barrel, their voices low and venomous as a rattlesnake's hiss. Came out of nowhere, they say, like a stray dog with pups.
And look at the boy, spit an image of the Stones. 6 years she was gone. Scandalous is what it is. And him set to marry that Eastern woman.
The words were a physical blow, and Claire felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She kept her back to them, her knuckles white where she gripped the rough fabric. Then, the focus of their malice turned directly on her. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched in a state of disapproval, addressed her directly, her voice oozing a false sympathy that was sharper than any insult.
"It must be a trial for you, Miss Miller,"
she said, loud enough for the entire store to hear.
"Coming all this way for a new start, only to find you're to be stepmother to, well, to the situation."
The implication hung in the air, thick and ugly. The word bastards was unspoken but clearly understood. "I imagine you'll be wanting to hold the wedding sooner rather than later," another woman chimed in, her smile thin and cruel. "Best to secure one's claim. A man with land and sudden responsibilities. Well, a woman would be a fool not to." The accusation was plain. She was an opportunist, a gold digger marrying Elijah not for love but to get her hands on his property. Every fear she'd had about being judged, about being seen as a desperate spinster trading herself for security, was being realized in this public humiliation. She felt dizzy, her throat tight with unshed tears of rage and shame. Before she could form a reply, a low voice cut through the store's sudden silence.
"That's enough."
It was Elijah. He had finished his business and was standing behind her, his presence a sudden, solid wall at her back. He wasn't looking at her. His pale blue eyes were fixed on the group of women, and they held a cold fire Claire had never seen before. The easygoing, grief-haunted man was gone. In his place was a hard-bitten frontiersman, a man you did not cross. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "My private affairs are not a topic for public speculation." He took a step forward, placing a protective hand on Claire's shoulder. The simple touch was a declaration, a drawing of a battle line. "This woman," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, "is to be my wife. Her name is Claire. She has more honor and decency in her little finger than this whole town has seen in a year. From this day forward, you will afford her the respect she is due. Is that understood?" The silence that followed was absolute. "Mrs." Gable's face flushed a blotchy red, and the other women suddenly found the floorboards intensely interesting. No one in Redemption Bluff had ever heard Elijah Stone speak like that. He had asserted his will, defended his own, and in doing so, had publicly claimed Claire in a way no wedding vow ever could. He paid for his goods, his movements deliberate and calm, and then, with his hand still firmly on Claire's shoulder, he guided her out of the store and into the clean, bright sunlight. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. The tension was no longer between them, but with the world they were leaving behind. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was irrevocably altered. Anna saw it. She saw the way Elijah's gaze followed Claire, the way he instinctively moved to stand nearer to her, the quiet, fierce protectiveness that now surrounded them like a fortress. She saw the look in Claire's eyes as she watched him, no longer just affection, but a deep, unwavering loyalty. She saw two people who had been forged into a unit by adversity. And in that moment, Anna knew her role in this story was over. The next morning, Claire awoke with a sense of unease. The cabin was too quiet. Elijah was already out, checking the livestock. The children were still asleep, but Anna was gone. On the rough-hewn kitchen table lay a folded piece of paper, weighted down by a smooth river stone. Claire's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was written in a surprisingly neat script, the words blurred in places by what could only have been tears. Asterisk Elijah, asterisk. Asterisk, I never had the courage to say these things to your face. Maybe I'm still the coward I was 6 years ago. Seeing you defend Claire in that store yesterday, I saw the man I first fell in love with, the one who was good and strong, and I saw that he loves her. He looks at her and sees a future. He looks at me and sees a ghost. Asterisk, I am sorry, for leaving, for not telling you about the children, for bringing all this trouble to your door. My shame was a prison, and I was too weak to break out of it. I love my children more than my own life, and that is why I must do this. They deserve a father. They deserve a home, a real one, with food in their bellies and no fear in their hearts. They deserve the stability you and Claire can give them. She is a good woman. Elijah, stronger than I ever was. She stood by a sick child that was not hers. She will be a good mother. Don't look for us. This is the only right thing I have left to do. Tell them I love them. Tell them their pa will keep them safe. Asterisk, Anna asterisk. A cold dread washed over Claire. She ran to the children's room. They were still there, sleeping soundly. Anna had left them. She was leaving alone. Claire grabbed her shawl and ran from the cabin, her heart pounding. She scanned the vast expanse of the prairie and saw her, a small, solitary figure, already a quarter-mile away, walking east, toward the rising sun and an unknown, empty future. Claire didn't think. She ran. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her skirts catching on sagebrush, her lungs burning in the cold morning air. She caught up to Anna just as she reached the edge of the property line, the place where Elijah's land ended and the open prairie began. "Anna, stop!" Claire cried, her voice ragged. Anna turned, her face a mask of tear-streaked resignation. "Go back, Claire. It's better this way." "Better for who?" Claire demanded, grabbing her arm. "For you to disappear into nothing? For them to wake up and find their mother gone again? Do you have any idea what that will do to them? What it will do to asterisk him asterisk?" "He has you now?" Anna said, her voice flat. "That's not the point." Claire's voice cracked with a passion that surprised them both. "He will spend the rest of his life looking for you, blaming himself. He will never forgive himself for letting you walk away. If you leave with those children, he loses them a second time. If you leave without them, you break their hearts forever. Don't take their father away from them again, Anna, and please don't take their mother." They stood there, two women at a crossroads, the future of a family held in the balance. It was then that Elijah rode up, having seen them from a nearby ridge. He swung down from his horse, his face grim, the letter clutched in his hand. He had read it. He looked at Anna, and all the anger was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. And in that moment, he finally saw everything with perfect clarity. He saw Anna, not as the woman who had betrayed him, but as a desperate mother who had made terrible choices out of fear and love. And he saw Claire, not as the mail-order bride who offered convenience, but as the fiercely compassionate woman who had run across a field to save not her rival, but her family. The woman who was strong enough to love him, not in spite of his broken past, but because of it. He walked over to stand beside Claire, a united front. He looked at Anna. "She's right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "No more running." He then looked at Claire, a silent question in his eyes, and she gave him a small, certain nod. It was a decision made without words, a perfect accord between two hearts. He turned back to Anna. Claire and I, we want to raise them, here, together. but they need their mother. He took a deep breath. If you'll agree to it. Anna, we can make a new life. All of us, for them. It was an impossible offer, a radical act of grace in a harsh and unforgiving world. Anna stared at them, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then her face crumpled, and she began to sob. Not the quiet, desperate tears of before, but great, gulping sobs of profound, heartbreaking relief. She nodded, unable to speak. In the end, it was not the life any of them had planned. Anna agreed to let the children stay, to be raised by their father and the woman he loved, and she, in turn, would accept his help to start a new life for herself in a town a day's ride away, a place where she could be a visitor in her children's lives, a presence rather than a ghost. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, she turned and walked away, not disappearing into the horizon, but heading toward a new, albeit lonely, beginning. Elijah, Claire, and the two children stood and watched her go. Then, Elijah reached out and took Claire's hand. He looked down at his son and daughter, who were now awake and watching him with sleepy, trusting eyes. He placed his other hand on his daughter's head, and, together, the four of them turned and walked back toward the cabin, a strange, broken, and beautiful new family, taking their first steps into an uncertain future. With Anna's departure, an entirely new and unnerving silence settled over the ranch. It was the silence of a space that was meant to be filled. The three of them, Elijah, Claire, and the children, were no longer a collection of broken pieces held together by circumstance. They were now, by default, a family, and none of them knew the first thing about how to be one. The first days were a study in excruciating awkwardness. Mealtimes were stiff, formal affairs, the children eating with a solemn quietness, their eyes darting from Elijah's grim, thoughtful face to Claire's gentle but hesitant one. They were two small, wild birds, tamed by hardship, uncertain if this new cage was a sanctuary or just another prison. Elijah, for his part, seemed lost. He knew how to run a ranch, how to read the sky and the land, but the terrain of fatherhood was a vast, uncharted wilderness. He would watch his children with a look of profound, aching love, mixed with a deep, helpless uncertainty, as if they were precious, fragile objects he was terrified of breaking. It was Claire who bridged the gaps. She had a quiet, patient strength that the children, starved for softness, instinctively gravitated toward. She did not try to replace their mother. Instead, she created a new space for herself. She taught Sarah how to make dolls from corn husks, her nimble fingers twisting the dried leaves into little figures. She sat with Samuel on the porch steps, showing him how to use one of Elijah's duller knives to whittle a piece of cottonwood into the rough shape of a horse. She read to them in the evenings from one of the few books she had brought with her, her calm, steady voice weaving tales of far-off lands, a soothing balm in the vast, lonely silence of the prairie night. The breakthrough came one afternoon. About 2 weeks in, Claire was helping Sarah braid her fine, blonde hair, her fingers struggling with the silky strands. Sarah, watching her reflection in a small, cracked mirror, said it without thinking, her voice soft and matter-of-fact. "That's how Ma used to do it." She then paused, and a small frown creased her brow. She looked at Claire in the mirror, her blue eyes, so like her father's, full of a child's simple logic. "You're here now. I guess that makes you Ma Claire." The name hung in the air. Claire's hand stilled in the little girl's hair. Ma Claire. It wasn't mother. It was something else, something new, a title created just for her. A warmth spread through her chest, so powerful and sudden it brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, not wanting to frighten the child. From his chair by the hearth where he was mending a bridle, Elijah had heard. He didn't say a word, but when Claire glanced over, she saw him watching them, and on his weathered face was a small, slow smile, a look of gratitude so profound it made her heart ache. From that day on, the name stuck. Samuel picked it up, and soon the cabin was filled with the sounds of "Ma Claire, can I have a biscuit?" and "Ma Claire, look what I found." With two simple words, a little girl had stitched Claire into the very fabric of their lives. Sweet, simple moments of family life began to sprout like wildflowers in the hard-packed earth. Elijah started teaching Samuel how to track rabbits, the big man and the small boy walking the fields together. Their heads bent in serious conversation. They sat together on the porch, all four of them, and watched the spectacular, lonely sunsets, a quiet unit against the vastness of the world. But their fragile happiness was always shadowed by the harsh reality of the land. The creek had slowed to a trickle, and the water in the rain barrel was frighteningly low. The nights grew colder, the wind carrying the first sharp bite of winter. The dwindling supplies in the root cellar were a constant, unspoken worry. Winter on the plains was a predator, and it was stalking them. With the first dusting of snow, the need for fresh meat became urgent. Their stores of salted pork were running out. Elijah cleaned his rifle with a grim determination. "A buck," he told Claire. "A good-sized one would see us through to the spring thaw." Claire felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as she watched him ride out, a solitary figure against a vast, gray sky. "Be careful," she called, the words feeling small and inadequate against the wind. He was gone all day. The sun began to set, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of pink and blood orange. The children were restless, their faces pressed against the window pane, watching for their father. As darkness fell, so did the snow, thick, wet flakes that quickly obscured the landscape. Claire's anxiety grew into a cold, hard dread. It was the horse that came back first. Riderless, its reins dragging, its flanks stained with a dark, terrifying crimson. A wave of pure, animal terror washed over Claire. For a moment, she was paralyzed. Then, the training of a lifetime, the ingrained instinct to be strong, to endure, took over. "Samuel, stay with your sister. Do not open this door until I get back," she commanded, her voice miraculously steady. She grabbed a lantern and Elijah's heavy coat and plunged into the blinding snowstorm. She followed the horse's tracks, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her mind a prayer, a single, repeated plea, asterisk, "Let him be alive! Let him be alive!" She found him half a mile away, collapsed in a snowdrift at the base of a rocky outcrop. He was alive, barely. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly shattered, and a deep, ragged gash in his thigh was still sluggishly weeping blood into the snow. A fall, she realized, a bad one. Getting him back to the cabin was a nightmare of adrenaline and sheer, brute strength she didn't know she possessed. She half dragged, half carried him, his dead weight a terrible burden, the snow soaking through her clothes, the icy wind tearing at her. Inside, she laid him on the bed he had once shared with Martha. The sight of his pale, pain-etched face, the unnatural stillness of his powerful body, threatened to undo her. But the sight of the children, their small faces pale with fear, solidified her resolve. She was all they had now. The Eastern woman, the mail-order bride, vanished. In her place was a frontierswoman, forged in the crucible of necessity. She tore strips from their cleanest linen sheets for bandages. She sent Samuel to fetch snow to melt for hot water, with a strength born of desperation. She cut away his torn trousers, her stomach churning at the sight of the wound. It was deep, angry, and filled with dirt and pine needles. She cleaned it as best she could, her hands shaking but her purpose unwavering, biting her lip against his grunts of pain. She splinted the broken leg with 2 pieces of firewood, binding them tight, her movements sure and economical. But it wasn't enough. By midnight, the fever had taken hold. He was shivering violently, his skin burning to the touch, his words a delirious, nonsensical mumble. The gash on his thigh was hot and swollen. Infection. The word was a death sentence out here. She knew what she had to do. Doc Miller and Redemption Bluff was 10 miles away. A lifetime in this blizzard. But there was no choice. She settled the children on a pallet by the fire, their eyes huge with fear.
"Your pa is very sick,"
she said, her voice soft but firm.
"I have to ride for the doctor. You must be brave. Keep the fire going. Do not leave this cabin."
The ride was a journey through a frozen, white hell. The wind drove the snow into her face like needles, and the cold was a physical thing, a beast that clawed at her, trying to steal the warmth from her body and the resolve from her heart. She was no expert rider, and the horse slipped and stumbled in the mounting drifts. More than once, she thought she was lost, that she would freeze to death in this desolate wilderness. But the image of Elijah's face, pale and still on the pillow, drove her on. She made it, battered, half frozen. She pounded on the doctor's door, a wild-eyed wraith emerging from the storm. The return journey, with the weary doctor in tow, was even slower. When they finally stumbled back into the cabin, hours later, Elijah was barely conscious. The doctor did what he could, cleaning the wound properly, setting the bone with a grimace, and leaving a bottle of laudanum for the pain. But his prognosis was bleak. "The leg is bad," he said, shaking his head. "But it's the fever I'm worried about. If it doesn't break by morning, well, pray, Mrs. Stone." The title, spoken for the first time, barely registered. After the doctor left, Claire sent the exhausted children to their bed and began her vigil. She sat in a chair by Elijah's side, the cabin silent except for the howling of the wind and his own shallow, ragged breathing. Snow piled up against the windows, sealing them in, isolating them from the rest of the world. She bathed his face, spooned sips of water between his cracked lips, and listened to his delirious ramblings, fragments of his past, a jumble of names, Martha, Anna, and then her own Claire, he murmured, his voice thick. The light. As the night wore on, a profound and terrible fear gripped her. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him. Not now, not after she had found this unexpected, impossible love in the heart of this desolate land. She slid from her chair and curled up on the edge of the bed beside him, pulling a quilt over them both. She laid her head on his chest, her arm wrapped around his torso, as if she could impart her own strength, her own life force, into him. She lay there, trembling, not just from the cold, but from the raw, desperate cow-cut of wanting to be his last love, his final harbor. Sometime in the darkest hour before dawn, she felt a change. His shivering had stopped. His breathing, while still shallow, was calmer. She lifted her head and saw that his eyes were open, no longer glassy with fever, but clear, and they were looking at her. His hand, weak and trembling, came up and touched her cheek. His skin was cool. The fever had broken. Tears of relief streamed down her face. His voice was a dry, raspy whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "You're the only light I have," he breathed, his thumb stroking her tear-stained skin. "If you'll still have a broken man like me." Her heart, which had been frozen with fear, thawed in a sudden, glorious rush of love. All the pain, all the uncertainty, all the hardship fell away, leaving only this man, this moment. She leaned down, and her response was not in words. It was a kiss, deep and certain and full of the promise of a shared future. It was a kiss that sealed every unspoken vow between them. When she finally pulled back, she looked into his tired, hopeful eyes, and her own voice was a soft, steady whisper. "We don't have time to wait for each other," she said. Winter finally released its hold on the plains with a reluctant sigh. giving way to a spring of breathtaking beauty. The land, once buried under a shroud of white, was reborn in a riot of green and gold as wildflowers carpeted the prairie. The creek, which had been a ribbon of ice, now gurgled with life-giving water. It was in this season of renewal that Elijah Stone and Claire Miller decided to be married. There was no grand ceremony in the town's dusty church. Their wedding took place on a warm Tuesday afternoon, under the vast, benevolent blue of the Kansas sky. Right on the porch of the home they had forged together, the preacher, a traveling Methodist with kind eyes and a weathered face, had made a special trip out to the ranch. The only witnesses were the two people who mattered most, Samuel and Sarah, scrubbed clean and dressed in their best mended clothes, their small faces a mixture of solemnity and excitement. An old ranch hand named Jedediah, who had worked for Elijah's father, stood off to the side, his hat held respectfully over his heart. When Claire stepped onto the porch in a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, holding a bouquet of wild prairie roses, Elijah's breath caught in his throat. This was not the frightened, guarded woman who had stepped off the train months ago. This was a woman whose face held a quiet, unshakable strength, whose eyes met his with a love that was as deep and real as the earth beneath their feet. Their vows were not the flowery, prescribed words of a book. They were simple, profound promises spoken from the heart. He promised to be her harbor, her partner, and the father their children deserved. She promised to be his light, his strength, and the mother their family needed. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Elijah did not hesitate. He drew her in and kissed her, a tender, certain kiss that held all the hardship they had endured and all the hope they now shared. Samuel let out a whoop of delight, and Sarah clapped her small hands, the sound a perfect benediction on their new beginning. Their life settled into a rhythm of peaceful, purposeful work. They were a family, in every sense of the word. They moved as a unit, a small, self-reliant constellation in the vastness of the prairie. But the peace they had fought so hard to win was as fragile as a spring blossom. He arrived a month later, a snake slithering into their Eden. His name was Bartholomew Vance, a land speculator from back east, dressed in a city suit that looked absurdly out of place against the dusty landscape. He was all polished boots, a practiced, oily smile, and eyes that assessed everything, the cattle, the water levels, the acreage, with a cold, avaricious gleam. He presented himself as an agent of progress, a man looking to consolidate land for a new, ambitious agricultural venture. He praised the ranch, complimenting Elijah on the health of his herd and the sturdiness of his fences. Then he made his offer. It was a fair price. He claimed more than a man could expect for a remote plot like this. Enough for them to pack up, move to a real city, and start a new, easier life. Elijah listened patiently, his face impassive, his arms crossed over his chest. When Vance was finished, he gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. The ranch is not for sale. Vance's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of annoyance crossed his eyes. Mr. Stone, be reasonable. This is hard country. I'm offering you a chance to give your wife and children a life of comfort they deserve. The slight pause before the word children was a deliberate, calculated jab, a reminder of their unconventional family, a hint that he knew the town's gossip. I said, Elijah repeated, his voice dropping to a low, quiet rumble that held more menace than a shout. It's not for sale. This is my home. This is their home. He gestured toward the cabin, where Claire stood on the porch, the children half hidden in her skirts. Vance finally dropped the pretense of friendliness. You're a fool, he sneered. I'll be back. You'll find my offer is more generous than the one the bank will make when this land dries up and you can't pay your debts. He returned a week later, this time with 2 grim-faced men and a surveyor's transit. They began driving stakes into the ground near the creek, the main water source for the ranch. Elijah confronted them, his face a thundercloud. This is private property, he warned. According to the county records, this entire water access is based on an old, expired riparian claim filed by your father, Vance said smoothly, producing a sheaf of papers. A technicality, of course, but one that means your access to this water is precarious. However, for a man willing to sell, such technicalities can be easily overlooked. It was blackmail, pure and simple. He was threatening to strangle their ranch, to cut off its lifeblood. Unless Elijah sold, the threat cast a long, dark shadow over their lives. The sweet moments were now tinged with anxiety. Every time they looked at the stakes Vance had driven, they felt the tightening of a noose. One evening, Vance cornered Claire while she was in town alone for thread. He tipped his hat, his smile predatory. "Mrs. Stone," he began, "your husband is a stubborn man. He's letting pride get in the way of your family's security. You're an educated woman from the East. Surely you can see the logic in my offer. You have 2 children to think of. Do you want them raised in this dust bowl, their future dependent on the whims of the weather? Or do you want to give them a real life? The choice is simple, his pride or their future. Convince him." Claire looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze as cold and hard as flint. "Mr. Vance, you seem to be under the impression that you are offering me a choice between money and my family. But my husband asterisk is asterisk my family. This land asterisk is asterisk our home, and we are not for sale." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the dust, his smile finally gone, replaced by a look of undisguised fury. Their situation grew more desperate. Elijah consulted a lawyer in the next county, who confirmed that Vance's claim, while despicable, was legally sound. It would take years and more money than they had to fight it in court. It felt as though the walls were closing in. Deliverance came from the most unexpected quarter. She rode in on the afternoon stagecoach, a solitary woman in a simple but respectable dress. It was Anna, but this was a different Anna from the desperate, broken woman who had left them months before. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her face still bearing the marks of hardship, but her eyes were clear and purposeful. She found them on the porch, the weight of the world on their shoulders. "Elijah, Claire," she said, her voice steady. "I heard what Vance was doing. I think I can help." She explained that in her new town, she had taken a job as a clerk in the land registry office. It was dull work, but it had taught her to read maps and decipher claims. One evening, out of curiosity, she had looked up the old railroad surveys for the region. What she found was a map, long buried in the archives, that showed the government had granted a permanent, unassailable water right-of-way to Elijah's father in exchange for his help during the original survey. Vance's claim was built on a lie of omission. He was using a more recent, irrelevant county map to override a federal grant. Furthermore, she had found correspondence proving that Vance was not a private investor. He was a front for the railroad, which was secretly planning a new spur line through the territory. They knew the land was about to become 10 times more valuable, and they were trying to steal it before the news broke. She handed Elijah the certified copies of the map and the letters she had made. "He never would have looked for these," she said simply. "No one would have. They thought the old grants were forgotten." Elijah stared at the papers, then at her, his face a mask of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. "Anna, why?" A sad, wise smile touched her lips. "For Samuel and Sarah," she said, "so they can grow up in their home. With their father," she looked at Claire, and there was no jealousy, only a deep, earned respect. And with their mother. The next day, the 3 of them rode into Redemption Bluff. They found Vance holding court on the steps of the land office, boasting to a group of ranchers about the new era of prosperity he was bringing. Elijah dismounted, the papers in his hand. "Vance," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "your business in this county is over." He laid out the evidence, piece by piece, his voice calm and clear, for the whole town to hear. He showed them the federal map, the railroad correspondence, the proof of the deliberate, calculated fraud. The other ranchers, who had been listening to Vance's promises, turned on him, their faces dark with anger. Realizing they were to be his next victims, the crowd, which had once whispered about Claire and judged Elijah's family, now looked at them with a new respect. They saw a man defending his home, a woman standing bravely by his side, and another woman who had returned to right a wrong. The prejudices, born of ignorance and suspicion, began to dissolve in the harsh light of the truth. Vance, his face pale and sweating, tried to bluster and deny, but it was useless. He was exposed, a common swindler hiding behind a fancy suit. He left town on the evening stage, a disgraced and hated man. That evening, as the sun set, Elijah did one last thing. He took the children into town, with Claire by his side, to the office of the circuit judge, with Claire's hand holding his, and with Samuel and Sarah standing before him. He signed the official papers. He legally adopted the children he had always loved, formally giving them his name. As they left the judge's office, Samuel Stone and Sarah Stone for the first time, Elijah scooped his daughter up into his arms. He looked at Claire, his wife, his partner, the woman who had stood by him through everything, and his heart was full. They had faced down the ghosts of the past and the predators of the present. They had been tested by the land, by the town, and by their own broken hearts. And they had not only survived, they had won. They were a family, forged in fire, and now, finally, at peace. The summer that followed was a season of quiet healing. The land, finally blessed with rain, flourished under the relentless sun. The prairie grasses growing tall and thick. The ranch, once a place of lonely toil and silent grief, was now filled with the sound of children's laughter, a melody that wove itself into the wind and the lowing of the cattle. It was a home, in the truest sense of the word, a place not just of shelter, but of belonging. One evening, as the blistering heat of the day gave way to the soft, balmy air of dusk, the four of them sat on the front porch. The sky was a masterpiece, a canvas of brilliant orange, deep crimson, and soft violet bleeding into one another as the sun sank below the endless horizon. Samuel and Sarah were sitting on the steps, their small shoulders leaning against Elijah's long legs. Claire sat in the rocking chair, the one that had once been Martha's, a gentle, rhythmic creak accompanying the chirp of the crickets. A profound sense of peace had settled over them, the kind of peace that is earned, not given. The children had been asking more questions lately, the innocent, probing questions of young minds trying to make sense of their own story. They knew Anna was their mother, the woman who had brought them here and who now lived in a town far away. They knew Claire was Ma Claire, the woman who tucked them in at night and kissed their scraped knees. And they knew Elijah was their Pa, the steady, solid center of their new world. But the why of it all was still a puzzle. Elijah, sensing the moment was right, drew both children a little closer. He looked out at the magnificent sunset, his voice low and thoughtful when he finally spoke. "I want to tell you a story," he began, "about your mother, about Anna." Claire's rocking stilled, but she said nothing, her gaze soft and understanding. This was his story to tell, their story. "A long, long time ago," he said, his eyes distant. "Before you were born, your mother and I, we were very young, and we were in love. It was the kind of love that feels like the sun, bright and hot, the only thing you can see." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We had big dreams. We were going to build a life right here, on this land. She was full of life, like a firefly in a jar, always shining." Samuel and Sarah listened, their faces rapt, their imaginations painting a picture of the young, vibrant woman he described. "But sometimes," Elijah continued, his voice softer now, "people get scared. The world is a big, hard place, and sometimes dreams get broken. Your mother got scared, and she made a choice to leave,
It was a choice that hurt me very much. It hurt her, too. In the end, it was the wrong choice."
He looked down at their small, upturned faces, his expression serious but full of love. People make mistakes, big ones. They get lost, and they do things out of fear or pride that cause a lot of pain. I was angry for a long time. But I've come to understand something. Holding on to anger is like holding on to a hot coal. The only person it burns is you. He smoothed Sarah's hair back from her forehead. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. So much that she brought you back here, to me, because she knew it was the one place you would be safe and loved. That was the bravest, most loving thing she could have done. And for that, she deserves not our anger, but our forgiveness. A quiet understanding settled in the twilight. He was giving them a gift, the freedom to love the mother they had without having to carry the weight of her mistakes. He was closing the book on the past, not by tearing out the pages, but by reading them with wisdom and grace. Claire felt her heart swell with a love so immense it was almost painful. This was the man she had married, a man strong enough to be gentle, a man who could turn his own deepest wounds into a lesson on forgiveness for his children. She rose from the rocking chair and went to them, wrapping her arms around all three of them, pulling them into a single, tight embrace. She buried her face in the space between Elijah's shoulder and Samuel's small head, breathing in the scent of them, sun, dust, and family. "You are so loved," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She pulled back slightly, looking from Sarah's face to Samuel's, her eyes shining. "My children," she said, the words feeling as natural and right as her own heartbeat. "You are my children." Later that night, after the children were asleep, dreaming their innocent dreams, Claire found Elijah by the corral behind the barn. The moon was a silver crescent, hanging in a sky littered with 1,000,000 stars. The air was cool and sweet. They stood in comfortable silence, side by side, looking out at the dark, sleeping shapes of the cattle. It was the same spot where they had come together in the heart of the storm, the place where a desperate, forbidden kiss had changed everything. But the memory held no shame now. The desperation was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. The fierce, urgent need of that night had blossomed into the quiet, steady love of this one. What had been a place of transgression had become sacred ground, the birthplace of their true beginning. She slipped her hand into his, and his fingers laced with hers. A familiar, comforting fit. He turned to her, the moonlight carving his strong, weathered features into soft relief. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "If I could go back," he whispered. His voice a low rumble meant only for her. "Knowing everything that would happen, all the pain, all the loss, I wouldn't change a thing, because it all led me here, to you." He paused, his gaze intense, his pale eyes holding her captive. "If I could go back, I would still choose you, to be the last one I love." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, hot and happy. They weren't tears of sadness or regret, but of a joy so profound it couldn't be contained. This man, this broken, beautiful man, had chosen her, not as a second choice, not as a consolation, but as his final, definitive love. She reached up and cupped his jaw, her thumb stroking the rough stubble. She smiled through her tears, a wobbly, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. "I don't need you to go back," she whispered, her voice catching. "I just need you to never leave me again." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss full of promises kept and a future yet to be written. It was a kiss of homecoming, a kiss that sealed the final cracks in their once broken hearts. The camera of our story pulls back, leaving them in the quiet intimacy of the moonlight. It pans over the silent ranch, the sturdy cabin with a warm light glowing in the window, a beacon of love and safety in the vast, wild dark of the prairie. The faint, distant sound of a child's sleepy laughter drifts on the night air. The story closes here, on this image, A family, not born of perfect circumstance, but forged in the fires of hardship, loss, and redemption. A family that was once shattered, now made whole, stronger and more beautiful in the broken places. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment down below and let us know your town or country. It's always a pleasure to see how far these tales travel. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us. We'll see you next time.